The initial drafters of the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto were very wary of starting a faction within the church. They don't want another faction, another club or whatever. Now, to be open about this, we are a network of people. We're networked on social media, we're networked in social circles and in professional circles and so on and so forth. So a lot of us know each other pretty well, but you're never going to see this group file to be a 501c3, a nonprofit organization or anything like that. That's never going to happen. And it's basically, this was formed as an effort to articulate an intellectual stance. And that's it. We're not seeing a whole lot of very credible effort out there to articulate an orthodox intellectual stance toward the restored gospel. And we want to do that. And we want to bring people together who are interested in doing that, to collaborate and kind of take advantage of synergy among projects that we're working on and things that we write and so forth. So no formal organization, not a faction. It's just an effort among some like-minded people to articulate this stance and promote it.
Today, on the second part of our special episode on the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto, I'm talking with Dan Ellsworth, a signatory to the manifesto and a prominent writer and advocate within the Latter-day Saint Radical Orthodoxy community. So you mentioned the word intellectual stance, the phrase intellectual stance. And I wonder, is this, again, I don't want to use the word, I want to use the right term, this effort primarily among Latter-day Saint intellectuals, or do you see this as a broader effort among lay people?
I don't label myself as an intellectual, and a lot of the people who are enthusiastic about it and contributing, articles and collaborating on things, we don't necessarily call ourselves intellectuals. Although there are, if you look at the list of signatories, there are some bona fide intellectuals who, with very strong academic and other credentials. When we call it an intellectual stance, it's exactly that. It's a way of approaching the restored gospel that, again, we're not seeing credibly done out there to the extent that we'd like to. So that's why we're rallying to this flag.
I would call you an intellectual in terms of, you're writing essays about epistemology, you're publishing stuff on, Issianic authorship from an LDS perspective. So it seems like, you may not be a professional academic, but it seems like, the kinds of people that I've seen, the signatories are people with a, deep commitment to a kind of what you could call a thoughtful faith and definitely an intellectual kind of approach. In other words, this isn't just a group of people who are saying, we believe. This is people saying we're giving reasons to believe.
Yeah. So in my areas of interest, I might categorize myself as a wonk, W-O-N-K, a wonk. I'm wonky about, biblical studies. It's an area of interest for me, and epistemology and stuff like that. And we have a lot of group members who are kind of that way. They have areas of strong interest where they would like to see some better explorations of the church's core doctrines. And that's why they're coming together for this.
So let's talk about exploration. That's one of the, as I take it, that's one of the key ideas of the radicality of radical orthodoxy, is the perception that there's something radical about a commitment to a willingness to explore what might traditionally, for more, I guess you could say, conservative or traditional members of the church, be off limits. It might be uncomfortable. Things like Black people in the priesthood and temple ban, or Mountain Meadows massacre, the role of violence in faith in the 19th century, et cetera. Joseph Smith's polygamy, all of those kinds of things. I wonder, though, if you could talk a little bit more about that word radical, because when I think of radical, and manifesto together, I'm typically thinking of Karl Marx, or, a movement that I think a lot of people would say, when they see those two words together, they're expecting something very unusual. And when I see radical orthodoxy, I see something that looks to me like radically orthodox. I don't know if that's a fair characterization from your perspective, but yeah, talk to me about radical. What does that mean to you?
So when I talk about what it means to be radical. The way that I utilize that word here is it is a radical intellectual stance to put forth our best effort to try to understand the core doctrines of the restored gospel. Okay. And it is not a radical stance. It's a perfectly, swimming with the tide cultural stance to try to impose external commitments, external intellectual stances upon the restored gospel. Whether those be progressive religious stances or whether they be, I'm probably going to make some enemies by saying this, but Trumpism, right? And weaving conservative politics into our religion in ways that it's just not intended to do, right? So those are normal and very common cultural trends. And what we're saying is it's radical to resist those temptations, resist those cultural trends, and stick to and really, really explore the foundational questions. What was Joseph Smith actually trying to do? Right? That is a huge question. And there are, countless really great books and articles and series being put forward exploring that. The Givenses are doing amazing work in that regard. What was Joseph Smith really trying to do? Rather than saying, okay, how do I find a Joseph Smith quote to support my intellectual stance that's foreign to Joseph Smith's worldview, right? How do I evaluate Joseph Smith according to some foreign contemporary, wealthy white privileged American ideology, and again, that is it's radical to resist the temptation to do those kinds of things and really stick to and ask those basic questions.
Well, and it sounds like the way that you're describing your experience and belief in this radicality is that it's a commitment to an account or an exploration. It's a commitment to an exploration of these ideas from a position of faith, while also, of course, using the tools of what we would call secular scholarship, et cetera. I mean, even the use of the word epistemology, right? Like is this nod to, the tools of enlightenment reason. And we're saying, but ultimately the commitment at the base is these commitments to certain doctrines and ideas that the church teaches are foundational, and we're not going to deny those. Am I understanding correctly?
It's sort of like that. It's almost like, and a phrase that we use fairly often is, what is our launching pad in our exploration? Is it, secular academic study of the field of biblical studies, for example? Do we launch from there and evaluate the restoration from there, or are we standing in restoration epistemology, the restoration worldview, asking restoration questions, but engaging in healthy and productive ways with these other commitments, secular scholarship and other things? So it is, there's a talk that Boyd K. Packer gave a long time ago that caused a lot of consternation. It's called "Which Way Do You Face?" And his point was, do you stand with the leadership of the church and face the world, or do you stand with the world and face the leadership of the church? We're saying from an intellectual standpoint, do you stand in that restoration, core mindset and epistemology, and go outward from there to engage with other ideas and other frameworks?
So if I'm understanding correctly, does this mean that there are things that would be off limits to explore?
I don't believe anything is off limits. The larger question is, what process are you employing in your exploration? And again, we come back to epistemology. If I say, for example, I can't support such and such restoration teaching or core doctrine of the church, because, scholars in a secular field of study have come to conclusions that this is not representative of reality. We absolutely have every right to say, what are the commitments that those scholars bring to their field? And are they operating from a position of neutrality, or are they operating with enlightenment commitments to reason and kind of an absent of any supernatural worldview and stuff like that? So the process that you follow, it means you interrogate every step along the way. Everybody should be very transparent about their assumptions and their worldview. But no, as long as you do that, why would anything be off limits?
So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that the radicality is epistemological in the sense that you recognize your positionality and you're being open about that. You're saying, look, we're starting from these assumptions about the world and about what reality is, and we're going to move out from there. That doesn't mean we can't explore our assumptions even, but it means that we're going to be loyal to certain commitments that may reside outside of, this enlightenment, the inheritance of the enlightenment.
Yeah. If you have an enlightenment specialist in New Testament studies, for example, who has inherited the intellectual history of historical Jesus scholarship and rejects, the supernatural, we have every right to interrogate that worldview. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with exploring the findings of, any number of these fields of study, just as long as we're open and transparent. And that is radical. Okay. I mean, it's countercultural to do things like that. It's countercultural to really pay attention to these kinds of questions and decide to hold to a core restoration epistemology.
Obviously, these kinds of efforts are not unique to Latter-day Saints, right? There are a number of movements, certainly Christian apologetics, writ broadly, right, has been going on since the 2nd century in terms of how do we view, how do we look at the world? How do we look at how we're going to use things like Platonic philosophy or whatever the case may be to inflect our worldview, right? And, so in the 20th century and today, there are a number of movements, early 20th century, people like Karl Barth and the school of thought that's been called it's called neo-orthodoxy, that was responding to, liberal theology of the 19th century. Similar movements today, things like in the late 90s, you get in the, among some Anglicans, you get another movement called Radical Orthodoxy, right? And yet again today in the Catholic Church or among certain Catholics, you have a movement that's colloquially known as radical traditionalism, or the rad trad movement on Twitter, right? Do people associated with the manifesto identify with any of these other broader Christian movements, use their literature, things like that?
No, not really. I mean, we draw heavily upon G.K. Chesterton. His book Orthodoxy is just an amazing, fun, interesting, foundational exploration of this concept of orthodoxy. But this is not unique to Latter-day Saints. Now to address part of your question, the guys who formulated the manifesto, it was just a group of 3 guys initially who then brought in the rest of us afterwards. They came up with that term radical orthodoxy on their own. And it was only after the fact that, we found out about this Anglican movement. And also, even after the manifesto was published, we found out that Orson Scott Card, a Latter-day Saint author, he put forward a definition of a radically Orthodox Mormon. And what he put forward there, and I wish I had it on me, I'd read it, but it was an excellent description of the stance that we're trying to articulate. But we didn't know about any of this until till after the fact. But to your larger point, no, I mean, this tension within religious communities, and not even just religious communities. Any community oriented around beliefs, or ideologies is not new.
The key tension that lies at the heart of the manifesto, as I take it, is this tension between these two camps within Latter-day Saint culture, which the manifesto calls progressives and fundamentalists. And again, obviously, progressives and fundamentalists, those things mean different things outside of a particular Latter-day Saint setting, right? Well, even within Latter-day Saint setting, things like fundamentalism does typically refer to people who practice polygamy, people who broke off from the church in the early 20th century. And so I wonder if you could say more about what you guys mean by progressives and fundamentalists, and where are those terms coming from?
So, and that's a good question. About a year ago, I read a book of correspondence from Flannery O'Connor. And Flannery O'Connor her correspondence with her agent and a number of people, these letters were aggregated into a book. And she discussed this, I believe it was with her agent. They used to have lengthy back and forth letter writing discussions about religion. And she talked about the progressive worldview. And it was basically this Enlightenment notion that you can apply rationality to problems, and human society flourishes when you apply rationality and these Enlightenment tools to everything. And society becomes more enlightened, more fair, and prospers, and so on and so forth. It's that kind of a worldview. And so it is this, really, it's just this very intense confidence in an Enlightenment tool set to apply it to whatever you're discussing. And when it's applied to religion, the problem is there are a lot of aspects of faith that are simply not tenable when you apply a strictly Enlightenment tool set to them. And if you're looking for the resurrection of Christ to be defended with a strictly Enlightenment tool set, for example, it's not going to be defended to everybody's satisfaction. And N.T. Wright makes a very persuasive case using historical tools, but if somebody's not on the same page as he is in terms of epistemology, they're not going to accept his argument, no matter how well crafted it is, right? So that mindset of application of Enlightenment tools to religion, it basically becomes, kind of a tendency to evaluate every religious claim for its rationality and its fairness, and does it contribute to these secular progressive notions of what constitutes justice and fairness, and so on and so forth. Now, none of that is to say that these progressive commitments are bad in any way. I personally hold some of these progressive ideals. Depending on the issue, I think a progressive mindset is the ideal way to think about a number of issues in society. But to stand in that mindset and evaluate all of our religious doctrines and our historical narratives and all of those things from the standpoint of whether they measure up to a strictly rational mindset and set of criteria, it's not even, there's not even a real reason to do that, other than kind of emotional or psychological cravings for it, right? So progressive, when we say progressive, we don't mean that there's a perfect alignment between somebody's secular progressive politics, for example, and their religion. We know plenty of people who are progressive in their politics, but who are actually very orthodox or conservative in their faith commitments, and vice versa. I know several people who are very conservative in their political leanings, but very, very progressive or liberal in their approach to religion. Now, when it comes to the word fundamentalist, this is one of those words that's awfully hard to define, right? We immediately think polygamist when we apply it to our faith tradition, but we don't need to. Honestly, I default kind of to the Wikipedia definition, which is this, it's kind of a three-part definition: an insistence upon the infallibility of sacred texts. So within our tradition, we have fundamentalist approaches toward the Constitution, thinking that it is this pristine, infallible, immutable, divine revelation. And towards Scripture, a refusal to apply any kind of critical methodology to our discussion of Scripture, or entertain, any kind of textual analysis, textual criticism, or any of those kinds of things. So that's one part of it, is this deep reverence for texts. And another aspect of it is kind of an obsession with boundaries and defining exactly who is in and who is out. And I know that's a criticism that was leveled at us for this radical orthodoxy effort, was, are you guys trying to define people out of a special club or whatever? And no. You can have a variety in your views about any number of things. This is a question of process. How do you really give the best exploration and defense of core doctrine before you take a skeptical view toward it? And what we find is that is generally not the case. And a good evidence of that is the amount of surprise and amazement at the work of Terrell and Fiona Gibbons. They're looking at core doctrines and finding the very best ways of thinking about them, and people are surprised. I've never heard that before. I've never seen that before. I've never seen this presented in this way before, right? And this is 2020 that this is happening, right? So what gives us the confidence that all of these other aspects of our faith have been given the very best treatment, have been explored in the very best, most inspired, and also intellectually rigorous ways? So no, we're not defining boundaries. We have no desire to do that. What we want to do is articulate a process, and articulate it in a way that people want to take it for a spin with their exploration of doctrine, with their stances toward the church and the church's core teachings. And so those are the main two components of this definition of fundamentalism that Wikipedia puts forward. They aggregate it from various scholars and stuff. But a third aspect of it is this very, very strict emphasis on believing exactly the right things. Okay. Now, again, this is tricky, because what we are putting forward is that, there are some things that you can't just jettison and still have what we have as a religious community. There are some things that you simply can't jettison. Or, applying this tool that we call Chesterton's fence, if you are inclined to be skeptical towards something, first give the very, very best defense of it that you can before you look at jettisoning it. So anyway, I hope that helps with what we mean by fundamentalism. And what we see, again, there's kind of this melding of politics and texts and religion. And what we're saying is the Orthodox approach is to look at what our church leadership are saying and doing today. And if they're not, picking up the Constitution and banging communists over the head with it, then maybe we shouldn't be doing that either. If they're not, saying that it's religiously off limits to vote for a socialist or whatever, then maybe we shouldn't be saying that either. A core epistemological commitment is follow the prophet. Look at their tone. Look at what they emphasize, and don't diverge from that. And again, with the rise of Donald Trump, I think there was a very, very strong pull among a lot of people in that kind of direction.
So, you wrote an essay for popular, I guess what would be typically characterized as progressive Latter-day Saint blog by common consent, where you kind of describe your process of coming to become a signatory of the manifesto. And in that essay, you talk about this group called DesNat. And I think that needs to probably be a part of this conversation about defining fundamentalism and the role of I mean, we'd have to say some boundary drawing, right? At least for you. I don't know if that's true of all of the manifesto itself, but maybe you could speak more to that. Like, how does DesNat figure into this? Because DesNat plays a huge role in online culture and among Latter-day Saints in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And DesNat, so they're primarily a Twitter-based group of people. They use a hashtag DesNat, and I'm kind of speaking for them, and they'll probably get mad if I misstate their intentions. But my understanding is that their intentions are to defend the church, right? And when it's attacked online and vilified, but also not just attacked, but when progressive Mormons post things that are contrary to the teachings of the church and so on and so forth, which happens a lot on Twitter. Twitter is kind of a zoo, right? So it's just a flurry of competing opinions, and they have jumped in and rallied to defend the church. I follow a lot of members of DesNat, people who use that hashtag, and some of them are frankly some of my favorite thinkers, honestly, online. Some of them write compelling, interesting commentary in that little Twitter space of characters on a regular basis, like really, really interesting and compelling stuff. There is a side to DesNat, though, that draws criticism from people like me, and not just me, but others, where, though, they get ugly and really, lash out in anger and vulgarity and nastiness in ways that honestly don't reflect well on the church. They're not in accordance with the teachings of the prophets. Again, we say follow the prophets. Well, that means approach situations the way you think they would, right? And I see Dallin H. Oaks being very, very firm in stating the church's positions on things, but I never see him engaging in nastiness and vulgarity and those kinds of things. And some of the things that they post are funny, just humorous and satirical and so on and so forth. And I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there is just kind of this ugly side, and that's the side that draws criticism from people like me. But there's also a side that just does not want to contemplate things that might reflect poorly upon church leaders, like the idea that Brigham Young had racist views. If you say things like that, which, by the way, Elder Cook, an apostle in our church, he frankly acknowledged it in a discussion at LDS Business College recently. He just openly said that Brigham Young held some racist views. And so again, following the prophet means adopting their tone, their comfort level with these kinds of concepts. It doesn't mean lashing out at people who are just echoing, honestly, the tone and the teachings that are being put forward at the highest levels of the church nowadays. So there is this gut reaction of extreme defensiveness sometimes that is a fundamentalist impulse. That said, I don't characterize most of DesNat as fundamentalist. I think, a lot of us, even who consider ourselves just kind of in the mainstream and Orthodox, we have fundamentalist impulses too. we kind of crave lines and clear demarcations between, what constitute doctrine and not, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that that everybody in DesNat is fundamentalist. There certainly are some members of DesNat who who lean that way. But overall, honestly, I think a lot of what they do is stuff I agree with. Anytime they articulate just a clear and sharp defense of a core doctrine of the church in a way that's compelling, I'm like, yeah, I'm right there with you. So I don't think it's entirely accurate that, I would not be accurate if I were to just characterize Desnat as fundamentalist. Another aspect of fundamentalism is this idea that in the past things were ideal. So we need to get back to some kind of ideal way that things were in the past. And in the past, way back when, a core amount of church leadership believed that the events of the Book of Mormon took place in the American heartland and in upstate New York and so on and so forth. We need to get back to that kind of ideal. That's a fundamentalist impulse, is idealizing the past and trying to get people back to this fictional, idealized image of how the past used to be.
So I'm picking up on two different aspects of fundamentalism here, which may, I think you rightly point out that, as with your effort, the manifesto community, Desnat is not a monolith. It's made up of a range of people who identify differently across the spectrum of belief and whatnot. And you point out that there is a faction, I guess, among people who use that hashtag, who people, have been, I think, rightly identified as alt-right, using Groiper memes and all kinds of other stuff that comes directly out of alt-right meme culture, troll culture. And I think when a lot of people think of Desnat, that's what they're thinking. And so you're identifying, that impulse as a form of fundamentalism, where it's this unwillingness to consider otherwise, and not just that, but a kind of militant and aggressive stance towards people that they perceive as their enemies, or their opponents, ideological opponents. And then the other would be just a more generic, and this wouldn't have to be identified with a specific social movement or hashtag or whatever, which would just be this idea of kind of not being willing to think for yourself, not being willing to, in general, consider possibilities, just kind of having, saying, well, we need to harken back to this idealized past where things were clear, and this is always, that romanticizing impulse is not unique to religious people, Latter-day Saints at all, right? Like, I mean, we've seen in the Trump era, especially, but around the world, the rise of various authoritarian governments and cultures is a desire to return to something that made sense. And there's this idea that a lot of people have. I think surely there was a time when things made more sense than they do now, because it's just so horrible. There's so much that's so horrible. But the reality is that time never existed, right? Like, there was no golden age, and it's not like we can get back to any place that's going to make any more sense than it does now. But am I correctly identifying these kind of two? You might have some specific groups who are not embodying civic discourse about. They're both embodying an aggressive stance in public, but also an unwillingness to consider otherwise. And then you have this other that's kind of a nostalgia for a lost golden age kind of thing. Is that?
Yeah. So there's several points, and I'm glad you kind of went there, because this lost golden age. Think about the potential for flattery, and again, this is a very common Book of Mormon term, flattery, that comes about when you say, "Hey, in this country, in the past, we were great, and it's because people like you were in charge, and we need to get." People like us who made this country great in the past, we need to be in charge so that it can be great again, because it's been destroyed by those other people and, their views of things. That is flattery. And it's, my word, that is so seductive and appealing. If you are a person who's just looking at the state of the United States, for example, and just going, oh my gosh, we are in trouble in so many ways. That's an immensely seductive message. Gosh, the solution to all this is for people like us to be in charge again and get rid of these other people. And it's very, very dangerous. And we do not, again, and I say this as a very, very close watcher of prophetic discourse. This is not a message that we're hearing from the leadership of our church. And if you're doing this faith in an Orthodox way, there is a very, very heavy emphasis on messaging that comes from leadership of the church. And we have the prophet saying that we need to lead out against racism, right? And we have one of his counselors saying Black Lives Matter. And putting forward these kinds of messages, if you're doing this right, and when I say right, I'm kind of conflating that with the term orthodox, you're going to be uncomfortable. You are, engaging with the prophetic word will leave you constantly uncomfortable if you're doing this faith tradition right. So there are tendencies, again, at both ideological extremes to remove or deprecate prophetic messaging that makes us uncomfortable. And what we are saying is, we didn't become a people who marched across the plains and founded, a civilization with all this blood, sweat, and tears by seeking comfort from our leaders, right? And being really selective about the things that they taught us. We hearken back to the pioneers and their sacrifices, but also even nowadays, reading McKay Coppin's piece in the Atlantic about just what a struggle it is to serve a mission and sacrifice and live this life of faith. We're not doing this for comfort. So when the prophet says lead out against racism, okay, let's get uncomfortable. And if we're doing it right, that's going to be our stance. But that doesn't mean that we go all the way to critical race theory and intersectionality and all these other things that have come to constitute a secular religion that's completely foreign to ours, right? But we need to figure out what that looks like for us as Latter-day Saints, to take the prophetic word seriously and resist these cultural impulses to, only seek out the things that affirm us.
Yeah, but while we're on the topic of culture, I want to talk about something that occurs to me and came up in my conversation with Dr. Rossetti about this, which is the polarities in the church that the manifesto identifies seem to be not just specific to probably the American church, but within the American church to particular communities that primarily congregate online. Right. So it feels to me like the manifesto expresses itself in as a sort of general address to Latter-day Saints. Is that the intention? Like, is this for Latter-day Saints worldwide, or is this addressing a particular subculture within the church in the United States?
I'm going to say both. Okay. And here's why. We are a worldwide church. Most of the membership of our church is outside the United States. It's very likely, and I don't know that there's an official study on this kind of thing, but it's very likely that most of the church membership nowadays is not Caucasian and has a very different educational profile and worldview than somebody like me, okay, who's steeped in American culture and has constant access to online venues and discussions and things like that. So once again, when we are not careful about these forces that are pulling us in the directions of American politics, American culture, we're kind of, we're living in our faith in a way that simply does not represent most of the membership of our church. So these American concerns are just they should not be as relevant as they are. Imagine, and I try to express this intellectual exercise to people whenever I can. Imagine you are in your local congregation in Utah and somebody is visiting on a business trip from Sweden, okay? Or maybe, if we were to go to the global south, say somebody from Chile or Brazil, and they come and they visit your ward. What kind of an experience do they have? Let's say, furthermore, that this person loves, this is a Brazilian individual, and he loves his socialized medicine in Brazil. He believes in socialized medicine. He loves the social services that his government tries to provide to people that are not provided here in the United States. And he comes to your ward and he hears about the evils of socialism. And furthermore, he's active in a political party that advocates for socialism in Brazil, right? But he comes to your ward in Utah and is confronted with quotes from prophetic leaders from decades past railing against socialism and so on and so forth. What kind of experience does this individual have at church? He just got a truckload of America, right, dumped on him, and that should not be the case. These American political concerns, conflating those with the core of our religion, it's just wrong. But again, going back to your question about the manifesto, absolutely. The manifesto it's definitely more accessible. It's oriented towards everybody. It's meant to be as broad as possible. But the primary consumers of it are going to be people who spend a lot of time online in online discussions about faith. And so that's a relatively narrow audience. However, it's becoming a larger audience. And especially, this last election season, we had just immense amounts of discussion about the intersection of faith and politics, maybe more than I've ever seen, certainly, among Latter-day Saints online, people who have never voiced an opinion about how their faith relates to politics or vice versa. With this last election, with Trump and Biden, they went online and they were very vocal. And some of these interactions were very unfortunate, angry, clashing, accusations of how could you call yourself a Latter-day Saint if you vote for this person or that person. So I guess what I'm saying is the manifesto it's almost looking forward in time to where, more and more Latter-day Saints are going to be having more and more of these discussions online. And if all they see, my daughter is almost a teenager. She's going to spend more time online than probably I have. And if all they see when they go online is a pull in one political direction or another and accusations of unfaithfulness to the gospel over politics, that's a huge problem. There needs to be a core group of people who rise up and say, we need clear lines between these political tendencies, these political beliefs, and our religion. Our religion is not an American religion. I know what McKay Coppins was trying to say. It's definitely American in origin and influence and stuff, but most of our membership is not in the United States of America. And we really, really have to be mindful of that.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you're saying that for you, what's at stake in the manifesto is a tension that's not necessarily specific to American politics. Because of the church's base in the United States, and particularly the how vocal a lot of especially people from Utah are on social media about the church, and people in the United States generally are about the church online, that they have kind of taken up the most space. But you're saying that you kind of see this as sort of a bellwether of things to come. You think that these sorts of debates are going to become more important for the global church membership, and that Radical Orthodoxy sees itself as, or that your interpretation of Radical Orthodoxy would be that this is going to have relevance to non-American church members?
I hope that it will have relevance to non-American church members. But even here in the United States, I hope that as more online interactions take place, as the growth of online discussion of our faith occurs over time, and these conversations multiply and multiply and multiply, I hope that people see, again, an alternative to these tendencies to mix partisan politics with our religion, because partisan politics have nothing to do with our religion. Absolutely nothing. They're very, very different epistemologies, very different mindsets and loyalties than what drives our religion. And when the church advocates for neutrality, it's not a wink, wink statement that they're making every election season. I mean, it is dead serious. It is dead serious. Because if we don't promote that as our religious stance, we're in big trouble. And I think church leadership knows that, and we need to be very, very clear about that as members of the church.
So before we go, Dan, I really appreciate your candor and your perspective on this issue, which I think, especially again at the current moment is certainly an increasingly big issue for Latter-day Saints, especially in these communities online. I have a last question for you, and that is, isn't what you're describing just kind of a call to theology? I mean, if what we're saying is beginning from a position of faith and giving a sort of reasoned, like, isn't that what theology is? So is this we have a very vocal, in Joe Spencer and Adam Miller, this movement, and I don't hesitate to call that a movement, towards developing a Latter-day Saint theology that can, I don't think that they're as concerned with defending the faith as much as they are with exploring the faith, and maybe that resonates with the Radical Orthodoxy effort as well. But yeah, maybe you could say a little bit more. I mean, when I think of Terrell Givens, that's what I sort of think about as this movement towards theology.
Absolutely, and I think that's an accurate characterization. I wrote the supporting essay on epistemology, and epistemology, a Latter-day Saint epistemology has very, very firm theological commitments, and metaphysical commitments regarding metaphysics and the nature of the universe and how God operates. And again, we are not in any way looking to exclude people as we articulate this. What we're trying to put forward is let's embrace this movement toward theology, and let's not hide from the fact that we're doing theology when we talk about epistemology and responding to critical viewpoints and stuff like that. Let's not be embarrassed that we're doing theology. Everybody's doing theology, okay? I read a lot of biblical scholars who are atheists in their leanings, and they do a lot of theology in their analysis of Scripture. They don't call it that, and they would probably not like me saying that, but they are doing theology. So let's embrace that. But yeah, what we're trying to do is plant a flag and say, watch what we do. And if this resonates with you, then join us and work with us collaborate with us on articles and publications and media that really put forward the best articulation of these core doctrines of the church. And again, some of the things that we do are going to cause some discomfort. There's always that kind of reaction to the work of Terrell and Fiona Givens, for example, but also, Valerie Kassler, her work causes a lot of consternation as well. But we are all operating from this stance, a theological stance, as you said, that the core of the restoration is reality. And so that's something that brings us together even in our diversity, and we can accommodate a lot of diversity.
That's Dan Ellsworth. We've been chatting about the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto and what the effort looks like from the inside. You've been listening to Scholars and Saints. Support for Scholars and Saints comes from the Mormon Studies program at the University of Virginia. Music is provided by Ben Howington. To hear more, visit mormonguitar.com.